Good morning, everyone. My name is Rick Evans. We are at Southwest Dallas Reasonable Faith, and we are very privileged to hear from Dr. Justin W. Bass. I want to give you a brief introduction to Dr. Bass. Most of you probably do know him, and some of you do not. Dr. Bass earned his PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary. He's the author of the book, The Bedrock of Christianity, The Unalterable Facts of Jesus' Death and Resurrection. You might want to get a pencil and paper out. He has a YouTube channel, and to get there, you just go to Dr. Justin Bass with no periods and no spaces. Search for Dr. Justin Bass on YouTube. Dr. Bass is the professor of New Testament at Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary. In Amman, Jordan.
Just say Jets. Yeah. It's easy.
Jets. There we go. And of course, we are very, very privileged that he is here to be in our tiny little group. He is a high-powered speaker, so the only way we can make up for our small size is we are recording all of this, and we will post it on Facebook and on our website and on YouTube and so forth. So over the years, perhaps many more people will get to see him. Dr. Bass is happily married to his wonderful wife, Allison, and they have two fine children, Ariana and Christian. Dr. Bass, we are thrilled that you're here, and you are going to talk to us today about opposing God. And the best I can introduce it is to say I think that's the last chapter of your book. I have your book, but not on paper. I have it on the oldest Kindle that was ever sold. So it's still working. So Dr. Bass, we are thrilled you're here, and we're going to pass this whole meeting to you, and you are in charge here.
Okay. Let me get my screen up. Well, thank you again. Thanks again to everyone for having me. Thanks especially to Rick. I always enjoy sharing Christ and Him crucified and risen again, anytime I can, anywhere I can. And what I want to do with the group today is I want to focus on one of the bedrock facts from my book that you don't usually hear about in books on these subjects, apologetic books, historical books, lectures, presentations on the historical evidence for the resurrection, namely that it is an undeniable fact, a fact that cannot be denied, like you cannot deny the sun is in the sky, that the Christian movement, which I think was probably called the sect of the Nazarenes, just a Jewish sect in Jerusalem, this sect of the Nazarenes began in Jerusalem, the same place Jesus was crucified in the early 30s AD, and it went on not only to triumph over the Roman Empire, turning the Roman Empire upside down, but it also has gone on to triumph throughout the world. It is still, to this day, the largest religion in the world. How can we account historically for the rise of the Nazarenes? That's the question I want to focus on. The Big Bang had a banger. So what then is the cause of this singularity? If we think of the Christian movement as the singularity, what created this Christian movement? What is the cause of the Jesus movement? Let's go back about 2,000 years ago to Jerusalem and focus on a Jew who claimed to be the Messiah. He was hailed as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, specifically prophecies like Numbers 24:17, Balaam's prophecy that a star shall rise out of Jacob. He had a number of followers. The calendar was even restarted for him. Year one would be the beginning of his messianic reign on earth. Who am I talking about? Simon Bar Kochba, of course. Who'd you think I was talking about? Yeah, Simon Bar Kochba. Of course you know about him. In AD 132 to 135, so about 100 years after Jesus was crucified, Simon Bar Kochba was hailed by Rabbi Akiba as the Messiah. And Rabbi Akiba, by the way, was not only one of the most well-respected rabbis at the time, but he's still quoted regularly and well-respected by Orthodox Jews to this day. Bar Kochba is actually the Hebrew for son of the star, a direct allusion to this prophecy from Numbers 24, that a star shall arise out of Jacob. Rabbi Akiba said that Simon Bar Kochba is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And once he made that proclamation, Bar Kochba led an army to Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, and he wasn't riding a donkey, he was riding a war horse, and he conquered the land of Judea, including Jerusalem and some of the surrounding areas, and he reigned there as the Messianic king for just about 3 years. We possess actual letters from Simon Bar Kochba, incredibly. Letters discovered in the same caves that we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran. And these letters are basically him writing to his generals, to people during that 3-year so-called Messianic reign. And even on the right, you see coins. He actually issued coins for his new kingdom. And these coins reflect the fact that he restarted the calendar. They actually say on one side, Shimon, for Simon, Hebrew for Simon. And on the other side of the coin, it says, year 1 of the redemption of Israel. As I said, he restarted the calendar to year 1. And we even have coins that say year 2 of the redemption of Israel. But sadly, he didn't make it to year 3. So he never got those coins out to year 3. And I'm sure you can guess how this ended. The Roman emperor at the time didn't like this turn of events. Emperor Hadrian, who reigned from AD 117 to 138, he sent his general Julius, along with his 6 legions, to crush this movement. And he did. In fact, one Roman historian tells us that this general Julius killed 580,000 of Bar Kochba's followers, probably an exaggerated number, but still shows you that he had quite the following at the time. He also tells us that Julius beheaded this would-be Messiah and brought the head back in victory to Hadrian. And afterward, Julius said to the roaring crowds, "Are you not entertained?" Now that's from Gladiator. That part's from Gladiator. But everything else I said is from the ancient sources. We don't know if he actually said that, but you never know. Maybe he did say that. It's interesting to compare Jesus of Nazareth and Simon Bar Kochba, since both claimed to be the Messiah, both claimed to be the king of Jerusalem and beyond, both had many disciples, both were executed by Rome. Yet Jesus to this day rules over a spiritual empire that embraces a third of the world. As I said before, Christianity is still the largest religion in the world. And Simon Bar Kochba, well, let's just be honest, many of you first heard of him today. How is this possible? Where are the followers of Simon Bar Kochba? Why isn't there a religion today called Bar Kochbianity or Bar Kochbianism? If you go to Starbucks, I guess when the COVID allows you, when the plague ends and we go to Starbucks again, why don't you ever sit by someone who's a follower of Simon Bar Kochba? It's very likely you're going to sit by someone who's a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. I think, at least concerning Bar Kochba's movement, I think we can definitively say, with 2,000-year hindsight, it was not from God. He was not the Messiah. It was of men. Luke wrote Acts long before the Bar Kochba revolt, but he makes a similar argument through some wise advice from Rabbi Gamaliel. Rabbi Gamaliel, another well-respected rabbi at the time, Orthodox Jews to this day still refer to him. He's mentioned in the Talmud. He was actually Paul's mentor. He's the one who mentored Saul of Tarsus as he was being raised up in Jerusalem. I want to read you the full account of Gamaliel's speech that he gave before the Sanhedrin. This is in Acts 5. This is the last two verses, but let me read you the full account. He's basically explaining why they need to just not mess with Peter and John. Peter and John, who are causing all this trouble, talking about this man named Jesus who rose from the dead. Don't worry about these guys. And this is his reasoning. It's starting at verse 34. It says, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed them, men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourself fighting against God. Some wise advice. And they did take it. They did take his advice. And notice Gamaliel gives two historical examples in his speech of messianic type leaders. These were before Bar Kochba, but very similar to Bar Kochba and his movement. They all had a number of disciples. They probably claimed to be a king or a Messiah type figure. But when they died, when they were executed, at least in the case of Theudas, we know from Josephus, the Jewish historian, he tells their stories as well. And he tells us Theudas was beheaded. When that happened, their movements came to nothing, just like Bar Kochba. And there were a total of, by my count, 14 of these movements that were a little bit before Jesus, during the time of Jesus, and about 100 years after Jesus. Bar Kochba, 100 years after Jesus' death, being the last of these messianic type movements. The Jews basically gave up after Bar Kochba. They said, let's give up on this fighting against Rome thing. Let's just focus on the Torah and copy manuscripts. None of these movements survived the first and second centuries. And we could add to this many of those other sects of Judaism of the time, the Sadducees, the Essenes, who gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls. None of them survived AD 70. Many religions that were prominent at the time, gods and goddesses that were worshipped, mystery religions, philosophies, all vanished from the world very soon after the first century. All of these movements, all of these religions, all of these gods and goddesses and philosophies that have vanished, I think we can say, just like Gamaliel said, they are of men. But if we think of the argument from Luke's perspective, he agrees with Gamaliel. Gamaliel definitely thought, when he gave that speech, I bet you it's clear he thought that the Jesus movement was just like those other movements. It'll fizzle out. Just leave it alone. It'll fizzle out on its own. It's not from God. This man, Jesus, was accursed. He's not truly the Messiah. So it'll fizzle out. Don't worry about it. But from Luke's perspective, who wrote Acts, who's recording this speech, he definitely agrees with Gamaliel, and is really kind of prophesying through this speech, saying, if this Christian movement is of men, it will fail. But if it is of God, it cannot be destroyed. It's indestructible, unstoppable, an immortal creation of God. Therefore, all who fight against it until Jesus returns will only find themselves fighting against God. Yet many throughout the last 2,000 years, whether through arrogance or ignorance or both, have decided to still fight against God and to fight against his indestructible movement, the church. It's happening even probably as I'm giving this message in China, in North Korea, in Africa, parts of Africa, and throughout the Middle East. Many are trying to destroy this indestructible movement. As G.K. Chesterton said, who actually died today on June 14th, 1936, this is his feast day, celebrate. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. So why didn't the Christian movement end after Jesus' crucifixion, like all these other movements did? If Jesus stayed dead, then how did Christianity begin? It's very difficult to get your movement going when you're dead. Try it sometime. Get back to me on that. Go try that and get back to me. Now, I think N.T. Wright, this great New Testament scholar, has it right. Jewish revolutionaries whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who had managed to escape arrest themselves had two options: give up the revolution or find another leader. Claiming that the original leader was alive again was simply not an option. Unless, of course, he was. Additionally, the Christian movement didn't just survive for a while and then fizzle out later, disappear later. It could have easily done that. Like, for example, think about so many other movements over the last 2,000 years or of all human history that have done that, like Genghis Khan's empire that was actually larger territorially than the Roman Empire, and it just completely disappeared off the face of the earth. No followers of Genghis Khan anymore. Neither did the Christian movement just remain in one part of the world for the last 2,000 years. It could have easily done that. Why didn't the Christian movement, the sect of the Nazarenes, why didn't they just stay in the Middle East or even Europe? Why didn't they just stay in Europe? Like, we can compare the Jains or the Sikhs. They've always stayed in India, and they began hundreds of years before the Christian movement. Or the Confucianists in China, always been in China. Or the Shintoists in Japan, always been in Japan. Or the Scientologists in California, we will keep them in California. We're not going to let them out. Even consider Hinduism. Hinduism is one of the only 4 world religions. Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity. Only 4 actual world religions. 97 to 98% of Hindus have remained in India for the last 3,000 plus, however long Hinduism has actually existed. Vast majority, well high into the 90th percentile, have always been in India. Think about that. If the Hindu gods were real, if Shiva or Krishna actually had power, if they were actually the truth, if they were actually representing reality, wouldn't you expect them to be able to cross their borders at some point over the last 3,000 years? Why can't they get past the borders of India? Hinduism really isn't a world religion. It's a religion of India, probably made up by the original settlers at the Ganges River that started telling stories about these gods. And ultimately, it's remained until this day as one of the only really forms of polytheism that's continued. I think we could say definitively that that religion is definitively of men. The Christian movement, on the other hand, is the only truly world religion. I think when you study these things, it's the only one that's actually a world religion. It has triumphed spanning the globe, representations on every continent of the planet. And the evidence suggests, all the Pew Research suggests, that it will continue to triumph into the 21st century as far as these things can be projected. And I love this word triumph. I use that on purpose because I love reading these books on church history and the history of Christianity, even by unbelievers, but they can't help but use the word triumph. I have a lot here at my elbow. Here's Peter Brown, this great early church writer. The rise of Western Christendom, triumph and diversity. The triumph of Christianity. Rodney Stark. How the West won. The neglected story of the triumph of modernity. Again, Rodney Stark. The plagiarist, Bart Ehrman. The triumph of Christianity. Copying off of Rodney Stark. And didn't use the word triumph, but still another great word, dominion. Dominion by Tom Holland, probably the greatest book written in 2019. Best book I read, at least. How the Christian Revolution remade the world. Triumph. This is from Bart Ehrman's book, The Triumph of Christianity. This is him explaining why he wrote this book. And if you don't know about Bart Ehrman, he's an agnostic. He's not a believer in Christianity. He's not a Christian. And he tells you, though, towards the end of the book, why he wrote this book, why he was inspired to write The Triumph of Christianity. And it happened about 20 years before he wrote it. He was standing on the Areopagus in Athens, Greece, where Paul debated with the philosophers of Athens. And he said this happened to him. He said, then the realization struck me. In the end, Paul won. What Paul preached that day on the Areopagus eventually triumphed over everything that stood below me in the Agora and above me on the Acropolis. It overwhelmed both the temple of Hephaestus and the Parthenon. No one except probably Paul himself would have predicted it. Yet it happened. Christianity eventually took over Western civilization. I love that he added that point that Paul would have predicted it. Yes, Paul would have predicted it. If we could time travel back to Paul and say, Paul, human history is going to continue for another 2,000 years after you. Do you think the Christian movement is going to continue to triumph? What do you think Paul would have said? He, the apostles, the early Christians, all who knew Jesus would have definitely said, this movement will continue. It will be indestructible until Jesus returns, because they knew Jesus' promise that I will build my church and the gates of hell will not overcome it. Like Chesterton said above, there were many times beyond the first century, over the last 2,000 years, when it seemed that Christianity was going to die, or could have easily died and been wiped off the face of the earth like all these other movements and religions and gods and goddesses. First, the Caesars. You think about the Caesars for the first almost 300 years of the Christian movement. The Caesars tried their best to stomp out this movement, and they had all the resources, all the power in the world to do it. From Nero to Decius to Diocletian to Julian the Apostate, and again they failed. Instead, within 300 years of Jesus' crucifixion, the Roman Empire was turned upside down. The cross went from the place of execution to the foreheads of emperors. They were baptized into the name of the crucified. And by the 4th century, the gods of Egypt and Greece and Rome that had been worshipped for thousands of years were essentially wiped off the face of the earth. Even adorable gods we love, like Thor. Nobody worships Thor anymore. It's a sad thing. Where's the Reformation for Thor? Why didn't Thor ever get a Martin Luther? Or Zeus? Or Apollo? Or Aphrodite? Jesus essentially said to the gods and goddesses of Greece and Rome and really Egypt, come out of her and never enter her again. I love what John O'Mara, another ancient historian, says. The collapse of polytheism was in the end sudden, universal within the empire, and practically absolute. Truly, the gods had lost, and Christ had won. Gods had lost, and Christ had won. And by the way, this is the worst part of Ehrman's book. He tries to argue for this kind of inevitability of the Christian movement overtaking the Roman Empire, that just because of the growth of them through evangelism, that it was inevitable that they would take over the Roman Empire. There was nothing supernatural about it. But it was not inevitable. There were many competing religions and philosophies and mystery religions and other worldviews competing with Christianity at the time, and many of them larger than the Christian movement throughout the 2nd and 3rd and even into the early 4th century. In fact, Tom Holland in his book, Dominion, makes that exact case. Manichaeanism, Mithraism, the cults of Isis and Cybele, Zoroastrianism. There were tons of movements like these that were competing with Christianity. So why did Christianity win the heart of the Caesars and not those movements? I like how Yuval Noah Harari in his book Sapiens, I just like this quote that he randomly is talking about some history, and he brings this up. He's an atheist. He says, historians can describe how Christianity took over the Roman Empire, but they cannot explain why this particular possibility was realized. I wish he had emailed me, because I would have explained to him the why. I know the why, Yuval. I can explain the why. Some other examples where the Christian movement could have been destroyed in history would be the threat of Islam, the rise of Islam in the East and the West in the 8th and 9th centuries especially. Christians at Constantinople and Charles Martel leading armies in the West at the Battle of Tours stopped Muslim armies that could have easily overtaken them and dominated most of Europe, East and the West. And if they had conquered, if the Christians had not won those battles, Christianity may well have been wiped out, or at least been subjugated to the point that there wouldn't have been any European missionaries or explorers that would have gone on to the New World. There probably wouldn't have been a Protestant Reformation, and there most definitely wouldn't have been in America. The Enlightenment, Darwinism, communism, all had many proponents who thought they had finally driven the death nail into the Christian coffin. And yet, what was most prominent during many of those years was deism. What happened to deism? I forgot about deism. Many of the most prominent thinkers were deists at that time, and that just disappeared, and Christianity continued triumphing. And all the places that have been liberated from communism, like Hungary or Poland, for example, they now declare themselves openly Christian. They actually say, we are a Christian nation, because they know what it's like to be subjugated by a non-Christian ruler. But probably the greatest threat of all to Christianity, I think of all of church history, would be the Beatles in the 1960s. Because if you remember, they talked about how they were more popular than Jesus, but it wasn't just that. It was mainly this prophecy from John Lennon. John Lennon said this in 1966, Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and we'll be proved right. Just imagine Christianity still the largest religion in the world. Let me close with just showing you this chart, the streams of living water, as I call it, flowing from the crucified carpenter into our world. I could do an entire lecture, a series of lectures on each of these, showing you the unique, unparalleled contribution that Christianity alone has given to our world, and no other religion or worldview could claim the same on any of these. There are unique aspects that Christianity has contributed that none of these others, on each of these, that no other religion or worldview can compete with. Divine love and forgiveness that has been shown in this world, inspired by Christianity. Freedom, not just of the individual, but even of societies. Literature, care for the sick and the poor and the disabled. Music, art, the scientific revolution. Human rights. Where do human rights come from? The pursuit of wisdom, the intellectual side, and an army of martyrs, a train of martyrs that go back from Stephen to the modern day martyrs today throughout Africa and China and the Middle East. But let me take an example of care for the sick, care for the poor, care for the sick. We're still in this plague, this coronavirus plague. Does anybody like hospitals and healthcare? Anybody a fan of those things? Where do hospitals and healthcares come from? Where do they originate? They don't originate in China. They don't come from India. They don't even come from the pagan Romans or the Greeks. This focus on the poor and the sick, giving them preferential treatment, began in house churches in the early Roman Empire, in the Roman Empire before it turned Christian. And the first hospitals, and all hospitals today, are modeled after the original hospitals, which were basically the monasteries after post-Constantine, after Christianity overtook the Roman Empire. That's where we get the first hospitals. I think a lot of people in the world, especially in catastrophes, like the Red Cross. Where does the Red Cross come from? A lot of people probably like World Vision. They like the Samaritan's Purse, especially just recently in Italy and New York City, when the Samaritan's Purse were the main ones setting up tents and beds and ventilators, and were even thanked by many of the secular leaders for the work they did, and yet they did it all in the name of Christ. But let me go into depth on another stream of living water, this pursuit of wisdom. This is reasonable faith, so let's go into this pursuit of wisdom. I'm not saying that only Christianity has had great intellects. Obviously not. There have been great intellects in many traditions, many other religions. I do think we have the greatest in history, but that's just an opinion. But the unique claim I'm making here is this. I'll throw down the gauntlet and challenge any other religion, any other worldview, to be able to do this. What you're looking at here are best-selling books by a representative, brilliant intellect who grew up either as a Hindu and professed and was openly a proponent of either Hinduism, Islam, a Jew, atheist, or a Buddhist or Confucianist, who then, by their own studies, by their own research, by their own pursuit of wisdom, discovered in Christ all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge and converted to Christianity. For example, the death of the guru, this guy, Rabi Maharaj, is a descendant of Brahmin priests from India, just like Ravi Zacharias was. He was a strong proponent and even a guru for Hinduism, a teacher. And yet he ultimately converted to Christianity and wrote this book explaining why. Laman Sani, who died actually just last year in 2019. He was a professor of history at Yale. He grew up Muslim in Gambia. And he had never met a missionary, never read the Bible. In fact, he became a Christian by his own testimony through studying the Quran and learning about Jesus in the Quran. Another example like Nabil Qureshi of Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. Andrew Klavan, you might have heard of him. He's a best-selling author of fiction, but he's also a contributor for the Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro's site. He converted to Christianity at 49. He'd been a secular Jew all his life. And he says the main reason for it is that he kept reading and reading the classics of literature, and he kept finding either Christ or Christianity as the center of all the great stories that humanity has come up with. Francis Collins, I'm sure you've heard of him, led the Human Genome Project, is now the director of the NIH, the National Institute for Health. Guess who works for him, by the way? Dr. Fauci. The famous Dr. Fauci reports to Francis Collins. And Collins converted from atheism to Christianity as an adult after reading C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. You should read the article about him in The Atlantic. There was an interview done with him about a month ago in The Atlantic. Read that article. It's excellent. Lastly, Lin Yu Tang. Lin Yu Tang was born in China, but traveled the world as a best-selling author, linguist, philosopher, poet, and religious scholar. He wrote many books on Confucianism, on Taoism, and Buddhism. He was an expert on the Eastern religions, but he knew the East and the West very well. He confessed to be a Confucianist most of his life. Then at 63, he converted to Christianity. His conversion shocked the intellectual world of that at least knew him. And he wrote this book, From Pagan to Christian, telling that story. And let me just give you the best quote. You should read the whole book, but let me just give you the best quote from the book, him explaining why. He says, "I have dwelt in the mansion of Confucian humanism and climbed the peaks of Mount Tao and beheld its glories, and have had glimpses of the dissolving mist of Buddhism hanging over a terrifying void. And only after doing so have I ascended the Jungfrau of Christian belief and reached the world of sunlight above the clouds." The Jungfrau, like me, you probably need to Google that. I had to Google that. What is Jungfrau? That's Jungfrau. Jungfrau, the main summits of the Swiss Alps. So as you can see, his excellent illustration, his wonderful metaphor, there might be some great truths and some great teachings and some great things in other religions that he found. They're below the clouds. But when I got through the clouds and saw the sun, that was Christianity, was the sunlight giving life to them all, the source of them all. And I love this because this is a man who was born in China, who was completely molded by these traditions and believed them with all his heart for 60 years of his life. This isn't like Billy Graham going to China and learning a little bit about Confucianism and saying, oh, no, Christianity's better. No, this is a man who was completely immersed in it. But then he learned about Christ and he read the New Testament and he saw that that is the true sun. That is the true sunlight that dissolves all the others. What other religion or any philosophy or worldview can boast of such streams of living water or streams of light, goodness, beauty, and truth flowing into our world? I want to challenge, none can. And the ultimate reason for all this is that Jesus of Nazareth did not stay dead. He knew his way out of the grave. If Jesus stayed dead, then all this was inspired by a dead corpse. I don't have enough faith to believe that. As the apostles originally proclaimed in Jerusalem in the 30s AD, this Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Acts 2:32. And the Pharisees spoke better than they knew, just like Gamaliel spoke better than he knew, when they said in John, look how the whole world has gone after him. The whole world is going after him. All the evidence suggests the whole world will one day bow their knee to the risen Jesus and confess him as Lord. He is still summoning us all to come after him, to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. Let us go to him. Amen. That's what I had.
You're muted, Rick.
Sorry about that. I was talking with no microphone. Thank you, Dr. Bass, very, very much. I'm going to ask our audience here to think of questions to ask you in just a moment. I am going to share my screen here. Dr. Bass has a YouTube channel, and you can search for that, Dr. Justin Bass, with no spaces, no periods. And if you'll write this down, I will take this off the screen in just a moment here. But Dr. Bass has debated Bart Ehrman, Richard Carrier, some of the most vocal critics of Christianity. I do not know why, but a lot of internet atheists follow Richard Carrier, and I believe he believes that Jesus never existed, which I think Dr. Bass and Dr. Dunn, you can tell us, as far as I understand it, most scholars think that idea is so silly that they just don't bother with it. But if you want to
sometimes
see
gets a footnote.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It sometimes gets a footnote in the scholarly books. Sometimes.
An occasional footnote.
Maybe a footnote. That's what it gets in my book, a footnote.
If y'all can think of questions to ask Dr. Bass, and there's not many of us, so if you just unmute yourself, and I don't think we'll have any problem just doing it that way. If we have a problem, we can switch to chat room or something like that. But if you have a question for Dr. Bass,
Can I say something on the last point?
Yes.
Mike Licona points out that on the matter of Jesus' existence, that it's virtually unchallenged. Now, Justin is saying correctly regarding those who are saying that. The reason why they're challenging it is that they see something that's so widely accepted, they're trying to tear at it or whatever, but it is so widely accepted, it's just not challenged. That's what Michael Licona says. And Justin, what do you think about that?
I compare it to Holocaust deniers. I think that's the way we should think of it, because the way historians look at Holocaust deniers is the same way New Testament historians and biblical scholars and classicists and ancient historians look at people who deny the existence of Jesus. It's not like they just all came together and came to the agreement Jesus existed, so let's move on. I mean, this came from 250 years of people being extremely hyper-skeptical and critical over the New Testament and over the historical Jesus. But all those hyper-skeptical scholars, even the most hyper-skeptical of them, like Rudolf Bultmann, for example, who wants to demythologize everything about Jesus, and you just barely get anything about him from the Gospels that's historically true, even he will say, but there was a Jesus. There is a man, a historical figure, this Jewish carpenter who stands behind this movement that comes from him. And so it came from rigorous, robust evidence and analysis for hundreds of years. And that's why it's basically just it's one of those just settled issues of scholarship, just like the Holocaust happened. We don't need to entertain people who want to write books on, well, did the Holocaust happen? this is just foolish.
Yeah, great. Good word. It is actually, the name of your book there, Bedrock. This is actually bedrock too, historical bedrock. And so good word. Thank you for that response.
Anyone have a question? Don't be shy. You can just start talking or raise your hand, or we're all listening.
Hi, Lee and Rebecca. My good friends there.
Yeah.
Hello there.
Hey.
Excellent talk.
Yeah.
Yes,
We
welcome.
miss your critique.
Welcome, Lee and Rebecca. I think you all know Rebecca spoke to us a couple months ago on a similar meeting here, and very glad you're joining us.
Thank you for having us.
I have a question.
Yeah, let's see.
Dr. Bass, as you, in the beginning of your talk, you were mentioning about regarding the, I thought it was kind of interesting because you took us kind of in a way that it seemed like the answer was Jesus, and then you told us the story of Simon Bar Kochba.
Yeah.
That was pretty good. But yes, but I was also thinking in Matthew 24, Jesus does make mention of that in the last days many will come. He says in my name, saying, I am the Christ.
Yep.
And I'm from stories, it seems like during the time of Jesus and even after that, many revolts came up with the Jewish, and a lot of the false false Christ were popping up. I'm pretty sure I'm assuming that kind of came to my mind that this guy was one of those that were popping up doing, I guess, because they did believe that those were the last days.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely in the background there. In fact, not just false Christ, false Jesuses, because a lot of these guys, this is part of those 14 movements I was telling you about, and the majority of those 14, I'd say around 7 or 8 of them actually arose right leading up to that Jewish war with Rome in AD 70, and at least two of them were named Jesus. So another one, actually, the story of him is very similar to this. I mean, in a lot of ways, not to Jesus's claims to be God or his miracles or things like that, but as far as what happened to him as he was executed before roaring crowds in Rome. I mean, it's amazing, because he was claimed people thought he was the Messiah. He fought against Rome, and he was ultimately executed by Rome, and his name was Jesus. And so N.T. Wright, even in his book, uses that one as an example to say, imagine his disciples, that Jesus's disciples in AD 70, in a cave somewhere hidden, saying, maybe Jesus rose from the dead. He just shows how ridiculous that idea is for them to have just come up with that. And that's the ultimate historical question, is why did the early Christians, who definitely had the same mindset as these other people did, when Jesus was crucified, I think all Jesus's followers, even the women, I think they just loved him so much that they went to the cross and went to the tomb, but they were all convinced that it was over. There was nothing more going to happen. This movement is done. And so what changed their mindset? What got them going is the ultimate historical question for the rise of the Christian movement. So yeah, so the false Christ, and I think we can continue on. I think the immediate fulfillment is people like the people that rose up in AD 70, Simon Bar Kochba, and then you could move on even to Muhammad, and even to, Jesus says, false Christs and false prophets will arise and deceive many. And so I think we can continue on that to even some of the founders of other religions and other philosophies, and we could even look at people who founded, anti-God type philosophies like communism and things like that. So I think all of them are kind of pictures of this ultimate. They all give us kind of a taste, a glimpse of what the Antichrist will be like. The Antichrist, when he comes, he will probably embody all of them at once.
Justin, you mentioned Tom Holland's book, Dominion, and I've been listening to it. It's excellent. But can you give us why you recommend it? What's so remarkable about the book?
Yeah, I think what he does he's definitely not. I mean, he just tells the facts like they are. So he's not trying to say, this, like Christianity overtook the Roman Empire, so that means Christianity is true. He's not giving a triumphalist narrative at all. He's just stating the facts. But what his main argument, which I think is excellent, is he's showing how the Christianity has really inspired all the things that we ultimately value in not just the Western world, but even as the East is coming alongside these things, kicking and screaming in some cases, but like on things like human rights, the equal value of all human beings, which you don't have like in the caste system and things like that. You don't have in other religious traditions, and that we're all made in the image of God, and the care for the poor and the sick, and this basic understanding of morality. All of that ultimately comes from, you could say, from Christ, but it comes from the New Testament. It comes from the Christian movement. And so he's always saying, that even atheists today who grow up in the West, like a Richard Dawkins, for example, is really in almost every way Christian. Richard Dawkins, in so many ways, is actually Christian. He just doesn't believe it, but he's molded by all these things, and he has some fascinating discussions of how even things like the Me Too movement is ultimately coming from a Christian understanding. And so many things are in our culture today is all sourced in Christianity.
So these would be those streams of water coming down from in your picture. And what's remarkable about Tom Holland is that, at least right now, he's at the door, but he's not a believer.
That's what made him so, and this is what led him to, and God willing, he'll become a Christian, because all that I'm hearing from people close to him is that he's going to Anglican services and may convert at some point soon. He said as much in recent podcasts that he's done, but it really was his realization first that, whoa, because he's an ancient historian by trade. That's his main work. He has an excellent book on Islam, and he has a lot of books on the Caesars and the ancient world, the Roman Empire. And he started to realize how different his mindset was than Julius Caesar, than the Greek, than the other people he's reading about in the ancient world. But then he realized, wow, all the things that I'm thinking, even though I've been an atheist since I was a teenager, they're Christian. I'm really a Christian in every way, except I haven't believed it. And so that led him to write this book. And then I think this book has led him, more studying of Christianity has led him ultimately to Christ, God willing. So yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, I highly recommend that book. It's kind of a big boy, but it flows real easy. If you just try to do a chapter a day, it's pretty manageable.
The audio version is excellent too. I've been listening to that.
Audio is a great way to do it.
Very, very easy to listen to.
Too bad there's no audio for my book. I'm talking to the publisher about it. Maybe we'll get one eventually. I want Benedict Cumberbatch to do it, of course.
Dr. Bass, could you give us the 2 or 3 minute summary of the rest of your book?
Yeah, so I did my lecture on this because I know you had Dr. Lacona, and in his book, and William Lane Craig's books, and N.T. Wright's books, Gary Habermas, when they focus on the resurrection, just like I do, they focus on these bedrock facts, but none of them emphasize this aspect, which is the movement, and not just the rise of the movement, which I think that alone begs for that explanation. How did it even get going? But then look at it throughout history, and look at the influence, and look what it's done. It's that hypothetical. I asked the hypothetical in the book: if Jesus rose from the dead, what would we expect? And I think we would expect, if there is a living Christ and he is Lord of the world, he should still be influencing the world. It shouldn't be just stuff he did way back then. He appeared to Paul, and then he kind of disappeared, kind of like a deist Christianity. And I think a lot of people have that kind of idea. There's kind of a deist version of Christianity. But we need to realize that Jesus, when you really study church history and you look around the world today, he's at work everywhere and transforming the lives of billions as we speak. And so that aspect I wanted to focus on. But really, if you go to the chapters right before that, like you said, this was the rise of the Nazarenes, is the fighting against God, is my second to last chapter from the conclusion. But the chapters before that lay out the bedrock facts that most of you are probably familiar with if you read the other books or heard presentations on them, mainly that Jesus' crucifixion, the fact that he appeared to a number of individuals and groups, and they believe that, and they even, some of them we know, we have strong historical evidence that they went to their deaths believing it. So those kind of bedrock facts that deal with what happened in those early 30s AD is what I focus on in the book. But that's what I think is unique about my book, is I only deal with issues that are agreed upon by everyone beside, the Holocaust denier type mythicists. So other than them, so I say 99%. So all the people who are basically teaching across the Western world and seminaries, universities, they agree on all the facts that I'm laying out in the book. So it's a fun journey. I use the time traveling illustration from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I don't know if anybody enjoys that. Great movie. But the part 3 is actually coming out. They coordinated it with my book.
I hate to admit it, I've never seen Bill and Ted's Excellent
Just see the first one.
Adventure.
You need to see the first one. It's a cult classic. George Carlin's actually their escort, which is amazing.
I did read your that part of your book where you talked about George Carlin coming in a telephone booth.
Yeah, that's how they time travel.
And travel through time.
They didn't foresee the iPhone. They didn't know about that.
Okay, I have a question for you. What do you say to a Muslim who says, well, look how long Islam has lasted and how many people it has affected? Why doesn't that show that Islam is correct?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And Islam is a key one to compare here. And the way I do it is really a few ways. One is you compare the origins. So if you compare the origins of the rise of Islam and the rise of Christianity, you see that when you look at Islam, when Muhammad died, the Muslims had already conquered multiple nations. They had already conquered and taken control of multiple nations, as Muhammad himself carried a sword and led armies and conquered and conquered and conquered. And so when he died, his movement, which was now tens of thousands of followers strong and really an army, continued to conquer and conquer. So one of the points I make in the book is this doesn't beg the question for the historian. I mean, it's no greater question for the historian why the Muslim armies advanced than why Genghis Khan and his armies advanced. And if Genghis Khan had a book inscribed and said it was from God, I bet you his movement would still be around today too. So in comparison to the early Christian movement, where Jesus dies, and how many followers did he have when he died? Maybe 20. And of those 20, like I said, probably didn't even think the movement was going to continue. They thought it was over. How many nations had Jesus conquered when he was dying on that cross? 0. And for the next 280 years, exactly 280 years, because if Jesus was crucified 33, Constantine declared Christianity, basically did this edict which made Christianity not, the Roman Empire stopped persecuting Christianity. That was 313. So from 33 to 313, you have 280 years. And in that 280 years, that is where Christianity really spread all throughout Eurasia. And they basically did it with nothing but martyrdom, love, sacrifice, and some of these examples like caring for the poor and the sick in ways that no one had ever seen before. And so the way that they spread their message was in no way by the sword. Now, post-Constantine, you do get a lot of that because Christians get in power. And as sinners, just like anyone else, they start to use the sword when they get in power, really against the teachings of Christ. But when you look at those origins, you see a key difference there and why one advanced and why. And so the historical question for the Christian movement remains. How did it get going? The historical question for the Muslim movement, I think, is very explainable. They're conquering just like most armies throughout history conquered. And again, if they hadn't been stopped by Charles Martel and the Christians at Constantinople, who knows how history would have been different. But I think I would say that was divine intervention that they got stopped. And it's interesting if you look at the map where they conquered during those about 200 years. So they were basically this conquering army, and they just swept through the Middle East, North Africa, and in parts of Southeast Asia. And basically where they conquered at that time in the 7th and 8th century, that's where they remain today. So Islam, basically, its headquarters and its main and Muslim-led nations are still in those same areas that they conquered. Now, Islam has spread all over the world, but how then have they spread? Mainly as refugees. So the way Muslims have spread in different places like Europe and America, in a lot of ways, it's been by refugees. As refugees, they've gone into lots of places in the West. But see, I think that's different than when you look at the story of the Christian movement, because the Christian movement, as they spread, they actually spread by, when the missionaries did it, like the early Christians did it, they spread by love and just preaching the gospel and translating the Bible, like the Wycliffe Bible translators continue, and things like that. So I think when you really get down to it, you see these really drastic differences. And of course, you can go back and just compare Jesus and Muhammad, and that I think explains it all. But
Thank you. Okay, anyone else? Think of some good questions. This is a great opportunity to ask Dr. Bass.
And I'll say another point, I'll just make another point on that too, on those streams of living water. I'd like to see those streams of living water done for Islam, for example. And you know, if you go back to what they call the golden age of Islam, there were some pretty awesome stuff that were invented, but you could argue that they got it all from the Christians that they conquered before that, but and the Greeks that they were reading. But since about the 13th century, there really hasn't been anything that you could say on that streams of living water aspect that has come out of the Muslim world. It'd be hard to find something that you could argue for in the last 700 years. Sam Harris had this great quote. He said, "Malala Yousafzai is the greatest thing to come out of Islam in 1,000 years." That's probably right. Malala is amazing, but Malala, if you know, y'all know the story of Malala. You know Malala?
I don't.
Okay, she was in Afghanistan, and she was one of the girls trying to just go to school, and she was shot in the head by the Taliban, and she lived. Bullet in the head, right here, and she lived. And she went on to speak to the UN. She's written best-selling books. She's gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. But it's amazing if you look at her speech, because she talks about even forgiving her enemies. She invokes Jesus. So she says, "I forgive my enemies. I'm inspired by people like Jesus and Gandhi." So even someone like Malala, who still professes to be a Muslim, her inspirations, she keeps pointing to Christ. So it's fascinating.
Wow.
If you were to ask that same question to a Muslim, why has there not been any real inventions or innovations or contributions to culture that have contributed to these kinds of stream effect? Two big meta narratives that would be possibilities would one be is that we're the victim. They really have that built into their DNA, that through the colonizers and through the modern missionary movement and through European colonialism, that they were subjugated, and that's why they feel they have the right to respond to their interrogators, to respond to the economic colonization of Muslims. And so that would be, that'd be an interesting question to ask Muslims today, why there has not been that significant expansion, much like Christianity has.
Yeah, and I've heard that, and I think maybe some nations could argue that, but my big pushback with them would be, what about the Ottoman Empire? I mean, the Ottoman Empire not only took down Constantinople, but then reigned and ruled over a large swath on its own, and took over. That's where the Greek Orthodox mainly were under the Ottoman rules for many centuries, and so they had incredible power and possibilities and opportunity for innovation, for growing, for learning in philosophy, for art, for literature, for music, for all kinds of things. But maybe I'm ignorant.
Global,
I don't know of Bach. What's the Bach from the Roman Empire?
Yeah, it doesn't have that global.
What's Da Vinci's Last Supper from the Ottoman Empire?
Mark, what would you say if a Turk was asked this idea of Islam's greatest influence from the 13th century on?
I don't know that I have a specific answer, but when Justin talks about the Turkish Empire and that, and the taking of Constantinople, that they say from their understanding that I'm not saying that this is true, but their perception of the Quran in this one regard is that all effort was toward the gaining of the great city, and that was Constantinople. They conquered the influential city of the world, and the Turks finally did that. So that's what the Turks see themselves as, and they're trying to, in a way, they're trying to rebuild that now, but in their current diplomacy. But that's politics now. That's not religion.
Yeah.
Per se.
Even the Hagia Sophia.
Yeah.
Why do you go to Turkey? You go to see the Hagia Sophia. Who built the Hagia Sophia?
The church.
Yeah.
My ancestor, Justinian. My ancestor, Justinian.
Yeah.
Emperor Justinian, the last great Eastern Christian leader.
And across the plaza is the Blue Mosque, and the Blue Mosque was created on the engineering of Hagia Sophia, same engineering, so the Turks learned it. And the funny thing about
they say the Dome of the Rock is built after the Hagia Sophia as well.
Is that right? So just
I'll give them the Blue Mosque. They can have the Blue Mosque. I'll give them the Blue Mosque. Okay, the Blue Mosque, they built that. Okay, what else? I mean, that's the thing. Sadly, I really do think it's just, I even appealed, Lee and Rebecca were there. I did a dialogue with a Muslim imam at a mosque in Dallas, and we had this great discussion, and I was appealing to them basically to go back to their golden age, go back to Aristotle, go back to the Greeks, go back to philosophy, go back to art, go back to mathematics, go back to, but sadly, there was a change around the 12th century. There was this significant change in leadership where they said, no, we're going to focus on the Quran and no longer deal with philosophy and math and science. And I think that was basically the death knell, and they've been there ever since. But they had every opportunity, and they did incredible things when they were focused on studying Aristotle and studying the great minds of the ancient world. They made incredible inventions and innovations, and that probably would still be happening in the Middle East. But I think sadly that they're focused on the wrong things.
Justin, did you recently hear about Steven Pinker, who is a famous atheist philosopher? I think he's an ethics philosopher, but he wrote just recently in the Washington Post, "Belief in an afterlife is a malignant delusion since it devalues actual lives and discourages action that would make them longer, safer, and happier." And that was in criticism of Republicans wanting to have a swifter reopening of the economy after the coronavirus. So, I mean, he's kind of equating Republicans with belief in afterlife, which I would challenge that. Not all of them are Christians, but it seems to go against your whole thesis,
Right. Tom Holland's,
Tom Holland's, yeah.
Tom Holland's Dominion completely refutes that. I mean, everything that Steven Pinker values, just about, probably, again, would be sourced in the Judeo-Christian worldview.
So what would you say to him if you could say something in response to that?
Well, I mean, if I had time with him, I mean, I'd want to focus. I'd really just want to focus on Jesus. I'd want to ask him, who do you say Jesus is? What, let's talk about this man Jesus. Let's talk about what he did and what he said, and what it's inspired. You know, where do you get the, but if I wanted to focus on those things, I would ask some of those questions, like where, you know, you definitely believe in human rights. Where do human rights come from? You believe in the equality of all human beings. Where do you get that? That's not self-evident. You know, where do you get the idea that all humans are equal? You know, I'd go through some of those things. But yeah, I mean, if I had a chance to talk to those people, I'd go straight to Jesus. I wouldn't. To me, a lot of those things are ancillary things that you can debate with them. But what I think will melt their heart is talking to them about the gospel, talking to them about Christ. But Pinker's a perfect example. I mean, he's a perfect example. In fact, in his book Enlightenment Now, you know, that's what he's doing. He's doing his best to try to say that a lot of those streams, like I'm talking about, come from the Enlightenment, not from before that. Like everything began in the 1700s, and there was no history before that, which is just foolish.
The Enlightenment came from Christianity. I mean, it's like we wouldn't have gotten it without it. Yeah.
Exactly. And the Enlightenment was led by people who were believers in the true God, at least. Voltaire was not an atheist. He mocked atheists. He just hated the corruption in the church. He said great things about Jesus, by the way, but he didn't believe he was God. Kind of like a Thomas Jefferson view. What were we going to say, Cesar?
Oh, yes, Dr. Bass. I was wondering, because you kind of brought it down to earlier when you said you want to know what does he think about Jesus. Jesus made that same question at the Caesarea Philippi. When he made that question to his apostles, he wanted to know who the people say that he was. And then he kind of narrowed it down to them. And Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered that that man had not taught that to him, but the Holy Spirit revealed that to him. Mm. My question is this: some people say that Jesus never said that he was the Christ, the Messiah, the Christ, the Messiah. He also was pressed down with the Pharisees also towards the end when he was being questioned that he was the Messiah, and Jesus, they asked him, was he the Messiah? I think that's the Son of God or something like that. I think it's in Matthew 26. I'm not really sure. And he was pressed, and he said, "You've said it," kind of saying in some ways, that's who I am. What do you think about that? That Jesus has never claimed that he was a Messiah. Do you believe that too?
Well, if you look at Mark, which I think is the earliest gospel, in Mark 14, I think it's 61, Jesus, or 60, he says, "I am." So when the high priest Caiaphas asks him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" He says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven and seated at the right hand of God." So what's going on with the Christ language in the Gospels, this has been studied a lot, and I think many are right that Jesus definitely didn't like to go around saying, "I'm the Christ." This is very clear. So Jesus doesn't go around saying, "I'm the Christ" or the Messiah, because there was all these misunderstandings of what that meant. They were expecting a Schwarzenegger type, Jason Bourne type Messiah that would conquer, a King David type Messiah that would ultimately relieve them from, take the boot off their neck, the Roman Empire boot off their neck. And so Jesus wanted to kind of distance himself from this language of Messiah around Jews. It's interesting, if you study the Gospels, when he talks to Gentiles, he has no problem with it. Like when he talks to the Samaritan woman, he actually admits, he says, I am the one, it is I who is speaking to you. She says the Messiah, when he comes, he'll explain everything. And he says, "It is I who am speaking to you." And also when he heals the man possessed with the legion of demons, who was from the Decapolis, who was actually from Jordan. That's actually where Jesus probably was, in the land of Jordan at that time, when he cast the legion of demons out. And he told him to go and tell everyone that he's the Christ. And so I think it was in the Jewish context, Jesus specifically claimed to be the Son of Man. That was his favorite, or just the Son. He would talk about himself as the Son of God as well. But the Son of Man was his favorite title. And I have a whole thing on that. I have actually a whole lecture on my YouTube channel on that, if you want to watch that, that I did on this title, The Son of Man, and why this is such an important title. This is my main argument with Bart Ehrman too, on how Jesus claimed to be God, because he didn't go around saying I'm God, because to say that would be like saying I'm the Father, and it would have confused everybody. So the way he did it is he claimed to be the Son of Man, which is that divine figure who flies on the clouds towards the Ancient of Days, who is God the Father in Daniel chapter 7. And so by claiming to be the Son of Man, he was able to claim that he was distinct from the Father and yet also God. So it's a brilliant Jewish way of making this proclamation that he did. But also his intimate relationship with the Father is the way he refers to that is as the Son. But he definitely was the Messiah. And when he was pressed with it, like with the high priest, because the high priest said, basically, I adjure you before God. So he basically put him under oath to do it. And so Jesus then says, I am. But ultimately, that wasn't his favorite title. But as you see, if you read the letters of the New Testament, if you go, once you get past the Gospels and in the book of Acts, what you find is Christ is everywhere. So all his earliest followers called him Jesus Christ or the Christ. So they all said he's the Messiah and then explained what that meant. But Jesus himself clearly did not like that title, probably because it had such misunderstandings at the time. That's a great question. God willing, that's the topic of my next book. My next book's going to be on the bedrock sayings of Jesus, the things Jesus said that everyone agrees he said. And just on those things, we know he claimed to be God.
Great.
Yes. I'm not sure if maybe some of you are familiar with the name Michael Green from England. He's a professor with links to Oxford, or was, and he wrote one book. It was a blockbuster, which is called Evangelism, and then another book later on, which I've been familiar with. It was called Evangelism Then and Now. But I've seen him. I met him one time, and I've seen him in vignettes on television back in the 80s and 90s. He made a statement that stuck in my mind, and it went like this: Jesus is the only card in a Christian's deck, and he's immensely attractive. And I think that is a nugget that I'm picking out of this today in your talk, Dr. Bass, how it focuses on Jesus, and we never want to let go of that.
Amen. Yeah, you summarized my entire philosophy and apologetic right there. I mean, that's what I think. I really think, I respect and support all kinds of apologetics, but when it comes to things like existence of God and the scientific arguments for God and the moral argument, those things, at least personally, just don't move my heart. What's always done it for me is the claims and the beauty and the person and the resurrection and the power and the love of Christ. That's what I think ultimately will change hearts and minds. God will use anything, so we should use it all. But that's my main philosophy with apologetics, is focusing on the person of Jesus and everything surrounding him, not just the man that lived 2,000 years ago, but also his influence to this day and those who have been inspired by him and what they've done in our world. So,
well,
yes.
even though I've managed, in your words, to quite succinctly summarize the contents of your book, I still think I'd like to read it.
Yes, please do. Write a great Amazon review for me.
Yeah, there we go. Dr. Bass, we only have about 4 or 5 minutes here left. Could you maybe give us a brief summary of what we can find at your YouTube channel? And I have a PowerPoint slide I'll show in a moment. But if you could just tell us what's at your YouTube channel that we might be interested in.
Yeah, 6 months ago, it would have been about nothing. But thanks to Michael LePen, like I said, I got a shout out to him because he's been such a great friend here. He's uploaded all my stuff. So basically, I've gotten all my talks, lectures, interviews, podcasts, audio and video, my debates. The debate with the Muslim is on there too, the imam and at the mosque, and some sermons I've done, sermons in Jordan. So you can see the way I did sermons in Jordan with the translation. So you have the Arabic and the English back to back on those that are on there. But yeah, so there's about 30 something videos on there. So it's kind of what I've been doing for the last about 10 years. So they're all in one place now. So that's a blessing.
Thank you. For everyone, just to remind you, if you go to YouTube, search for Dr. Justin Bass with no spaces and no period. And the name of your book, The Bedrock of Christianity, where's the best place to find that, Dr. Bass?
Just ordering it on Amazon, I think, and they have the Kindle version on Amazon too. So like you can get it on Kindle as well. If you're not like me and have to have everything physical.
There you go. People, our time is about up. Does anyone have one final comment before we go? If you want to unmute yourselves, let's give Dr. Bass a hand, and we thank you so much for presenting to us and giving us this great information. And I'm really looking forward to looking at your YouTube channel, and also read part of your book, reading the rest of your book.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blessing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Lee. We'll see you soon.
Yeah.
Good to see you all.
Good to see everyone. Thank
So long,
you.
everyone.
I'm going to share a screen here about Dr. Bass, and then the final screen will be with our own Deacon Vince Easley, who will present to us this Thursday, chapter 4 of the of On Guard, the book On Guard, William Lane Craig. Please, everyone, write this Zoom number down because it was advertised incorrectly previously. So if you're available to come Thursday to hear Vince Easley, please write this Zoom number down and the password because it's different than what we said earlier.
E-U-A, capital A.
Yeah, that's a capital A, small V-U, capital D. Thank you again very much, Dr. Bass. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
So long,
you.
all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Christ is risen indeed.
He's
Amen.
risen indeed.
See you.